Robert Chen stood at the edge of what remained of his inheritance, staring at the skeletal frames of prefabricated homes rising from land that should have been empty. Dust coated his work boots as a flatbed truck rumbled past, hauling steel beams toward the construction site that had materialized in the 3 weeks since his uncle's funeral. The workers didn't acknowledge him. They moved with the confidence of men who belonged there, while Robert felt like an intruder on property that had been in his family for 60 years. His uncle Thomas had left him the ranch in Montana, 200 acres of scrubland that hadn't supported cattle in a decade. The lawyer had presented the deed with apologetic efficiency, explaining that Thomas had let the property deteriorate in his final years. Robert had accepted it without expectation. He was 58, recently laid off from the assembly plant in Detroit, and a piece of land in Montana seemed like a quiet place to figure out what came next. He'd driven out 2 months after the funeral, expecting solitude and repair work. Instead, he found a construction crew breaking ground on what appeared to be a housing development. The foreman, a thick-shouldered man in a company polo shirt, approached with the casual authority of someone delivering news rather than seeking permission. His clipboard caught the afternoon sun. "You lost?" the foreman asked. "This is my land," Robert said. "My uncle left it to me." The foreman's expression didn't change. "You're mistaken. This property belongs to Summit Ridge Development. We've got all the permits." Robert pulled the deed from his jacket pocket. The paper was crisp, notarized 3 months earlier. The foreman glanced at it and shrugged. "Don't know what to tell you. We've been working with the county for 8 months. Everything's legal." 8 months, Robert repeated. "My uncle died 4 months ago." "Then maybe your uncle sold it before he passed. You should check with your lawyer." The foreman turned back toward the construction site, dismissing Robert with a gesture. Robert drove into town as the sun dropped behind the Bitterroot Range. Lewiston was the kind of place where hardware stores outnumbered restaurants, where everyone knew which families had been there for generations and which had arrived after the last boom. He found the county clerk's office still open, a small building next to the courthouse that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. The clerk was a woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain. She pulled up the property records without comment, her fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. When she turned the monitor toward Robert, he saw his uncle's name crossed out in the system. Below it, Summit Ridge Development, LLC, transfer date, 11 months ago. "That's not possible," Robert said. "My uncle never mentioned selling." The clerk printed the transfer document. The signature at the bottom looked like Thomas Chen's. The edge, same loose scrawl Robert had seen on birthday cards and Christmas letters. But Thomas had been in hospice 11 months ago, barely able to hold a pen. "Who notarized this?" Robert asked. The clerk pointed to the stamp. "Martin Vickery. He's a notary at First Mountain Bank." Robert found Vickery at the bank the next morning. The man was in his 40s, professionally groomed, with the smooth manner of someone who'd spent years managing other people's anxiety about money. He looked at the transfer document through his office window, then invited Robert inside with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I remember this transaction," Vickery said. "Your uncle came in with representatives from Summit Ridge. Everything was in order." "My uncle was in hospice 11 months ago," Robert said. "Stage 4 cancer. He couldn't have come to a bank." Vickery's smile tightened. "I saw his identification. He signed in my presence. Show me the visitor log. Show me the security footage. Bank policy doesn't allow us to share that information without a court order. Vickery stood, signaling the end of the conversation. If you believe there was fraud, you should contact law enforcement. But I assure you, everything was handled properly. Robert spent the afternoon at the county courthouse, scrolling through property records on a public computer. Summit Ridge Development had been registered 14 months earlier. The LLC listed two principals, Marcus Webb and Jennifer Castellano. A search on his phone showed Webb as a real estate developer from Bozeman with a string of residential projects across Montana. Castellano was an attorney specializing in property law. Their website featured renderings of upscale communities, testimonials from satisfied residents, and a portfolio that suggested access to substantial capital. He called the number listed for Summit Ridge. A receptionist with a practiced voice told him Webb was unavailable but could schedule a consultation for the following week. Robert said he'd wait and drove to the address listed on the website, a glass-fronted office in a renovated warehouse district in Missoula, 2 hours from Lewiston. Webb's office occupied the third floor. The receptionist who'd answered the phone looked up from her computer with professional wariness. Before she could speak, a door opened and Marcus Webb emerged. He was in his early 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Robert had made in a month at the plant. His handshake was firm, his smile calibrated for confidence. "Mr. Chen, I heard you stop by the construction site. Come in." Webb's office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Clark Fork River. Architectural models of housing developments lined shelves along one wall. Webb gestured to a leather chair and sat behind a desk of polished oak. "I understand this must be confusing," Webb said, "but I assure you we acquired that property through legitimate channels. Your uncle was very clear about wanting to sell. He'd let the ranch deteriorate, and medical bills were mounting. We offered him fair market value." "He was in hospice," Robert said. "He couldn't travel." "We accommodated his situation, met him where he needed us to be." Webb opened a folder on his desk, sliding a document across. "This is the purchase agreement. Signed and notarized. $300,000 transferred to his account. I can provide bank statements if needed." Robert looked at the signature. It matched the one on the transfer document. But he'd visited Thomas in hospice 11 months ago. His uncle's hands had trembled from the medication. His signature on the hospice forms had been an illegible scratch. "I want to see the video of the signing," Robert said. "There wasn't one. Privacy concerns." "Then I want to talk to whoever witnessed it besides the notary." Webb's smile cooled. "Mr. Chen, I've been patient because I understand this is emotional. But Summit Ridge has invested significant capital in this project. We have contracts with subcontractors, commitments to buyers. If you pursue this, you'll be facing a legal battle you can't afford against a company with substantial resources. I'd advise you to let it go." Robert stood. "I'll see you in court." "You'll lose," Webb said, "and when you do, we'll pursue damages for the delays you've caused." Robert drove back to Lewiston as darkness settled over the valley. He'd saved $30,000 from his severance package. A lawyer would consume that in months, maybe weeks. But his uncle had raised him after his parents died, had taught him to rebuild engines and fence pastures, had left him the only asset he'd possessed. Robert wasn't going to let it disappear into corporate machinery without a fight. He found an attorney through a referral from the county clerk, a woman named Patricia Rourke, who practiced out of a small office above a feed store. Her walls were covered with plaques from agricultural law associations and framed letters from clients. She listened to Robert's story without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting. "The signature match is going to be a problem," Rourke said when he finished. "Even if your uncle was incapacitated, if a notary swears they witnessed the signing, that carries weight." "It's forged," Robert said. "Proving that will require a handwriting expert, which is expensive, and even then courts give deference to notarized documents." Rourke leaned back in her chair. "But there might be another angle. If your uncle was mentally incapacitated at the time of signing, the contract could be void regardless of the signature's authenticity. He was on morphine, barely conscious. Do you have medical records documenting his condition?" "The hospice should have them." "Get them. I'll also need a timeline of the property transfer, when the sale allegedly occurred, when the deed was recorded, when Summit Ridge started development. We need to build a case that shows this transaction couldn't have happened the way they claim." Robert spent the next week constructing a timeline. The hospice provided Thomas's medical records, which showed he'd been admitted 9 months before his death, 2 months before the alleged sale. The notes from that period described severe cognitive impairment, inability to make decisions about his care, and continuous pain management that left him sedated most of the day. The attending physician's assessment was unambiguous. Thomas Chin lacked capacity to execute legal documents. Robert also obtained his uncle's bank records through the estate. $300,000 had been deposited into Thomas's account 11 months ago, on the same date as the property transfer. But the money had been withdrawn a week later in a single transaction, transferred to an account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. Thomas had never mentioned foreign banks. He'd kept his savings in a credit union in Lewiston, where he'd been a member for 40 years. Rourke filed a motion to void the property transfer on the grounds of incapacity and fraud. Summit Ridge responded with a motion to dismiss, attaching affidavits from Vickery and Webb, swearing they'd met with Thomas Chen, found him lucid and willing to sell, and completed the transaction according to law. They included photographs of the signing. Thomas, seated at a table, pen in hand, Webb and Vickery standing beside him. But something about the photos bothered Robert. The man in the pictures looked like his uncle, but thinner than he should have been at that stage, and the room wasn't the hospice. It was someone's home office, wood paneling and Western art on the walls. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, construction on the property continued. Robert drove past every few days, watching as foundations were poured and walls went up. The development was taking shape. 12 single-family homes arranged around a central green space, each lot carefully positioned to maximize views of the mountains. Summit Ridge was moving fast, racing to create facts on the ground that would make reversal costly and complicated. Robert couldn't afford to wait. He started his own investigation, beginning with Martin Vickery. The notary had claimed to remember the transaction clearly, but Robert wanted to know more about the man's relationship with Summit Ridge. He spent evenings at the county clerk's office, going through property records. Vickery's name appeared on notarizations for 3 other Summit Ridge transactions in the past year, all involving elderly property owners, all occurring within weeks of hospitalization or death. One name stood out: Margaret Hollis, an 82-year-old widow who'd owned 100 acres north of Helena. Summit Ridge had purchased her land 13 months ago. Margaret had died 2 months later. Robert found her daughter, Linda, through an online search. She lived in Billings and agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near her office. Linda Hollis was a school administrator in her 50s, with the weary look of someone who'd recently finished fighting a losing battle. She ordered black coffee and sat across from Robert with her hands wrapped around the cup. "My mother would never have sold that land," Linda said. "She'd lived there since she married my father in 1905. She used to say she'd be buried on that property." "Summit Ridge claims she signed a purchase agreement," Robert said. "She did, but she had dementia. I'd been trying to get power of attorney for a year, but she kept refusing. Then suddenly these people show up with a notarized sale agreement and a cashier's check. By the time I found out, the transfer was recorded and they were grading the land." "Did you challenge it?" Linda shook her head. "My lawyer said it would cost $100,000 with no guarantee of success. I didn't have that kind of money. I had to let it go." "The notary was Martin Vickery?" "Yes." "How did you know?" Robert showed her the documents from his uncle's case. Linda studied them, her expression hardening. "It's the same pattern. Elderly owner, medical crisis, sudden sale through Vickery, money disappearing offshore. They're running a system." "Do you still have your mother's medical records?" "Everything. I kept it all in case I ever found a way to go after them." Linda pulled out her phone. "I'll send you copies. And there's something else you should know. After my mother died, I got a call from someone at the county assessor's office. He said there'd been complaints about property assessments in the area where Summit Ridge was buying land. Assessments that seemed low compared to market value, which made the sales look more reasonable than they were. He couldn't prove anything, but he said I should look into who was doing the assessments." Robert spent that evening reviewing assessment records. The properties Summit Ridge had acquired had all been assessed by the same county appraiser, Daniel Garrett, a man who'd held the position for 3 years. Robert pulled Garrett's financial disclosures, which were public record. 2 years earlier, Garrett had taken a loan from First Mountain Bank for $75,000. The loan officer who'd approved it was Martin Vickery. The connections were forming a web. Garrett undervalued properties to make Summit Ridge's purchase prices appear fair. Vickery notarized fraudulent sales documents. Webb orchestrated the acquisitions and pushed development forward before anyone could challenge the transactions. And somewhere in the background, money was flowing offshore to accounts that would be impossible to trace. Robert brought the new information to Patricia Rourke. She spread the documents across her desk, studying the pattern. When she looked up, there was something like satisfaction in her expression. "This is bigger than your case," she said. "This is organized fraud. We need to bring in the FBI. Will they care about property fraud in Montana? They'll care about wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. That's federal jurisdiction." Rourke picked up her phone. "I have a contact at the Bureau in Helena. Let me make a call." The FBI agent who came to Lewiston was a woman named Sarah Corrigan, mid-40s, with a methodical demeanor of someone who'd spent years building complex cases. She met Robert and Rourke at the attorney's office, listened to the evidence, and made notes in a leather-bound notebook. "How many properties?" Corrigan asked. "At least 4 that we've documented," Rourke said. "There may be more. And the money always goes offshore. Every time. Same pattern, large deposit, quick withdrawal to Cayman accounts." Corrigan closed her notebook. "I'll need to brief my supervisor, but this looks like it warrants investigation. Don't discuss this with anyone outside this room. If Webb and his associates catch wind of federal interest, they'll start destroying evidence." "What about my uncle's property?" Robert asked. "The civil case continues on its own timeline. But if we can prove criminal fraud, it'll strengthen your position significantly." Corrigan stood. "In the meantime, keep documenting everything, every conversation, every document, every transaction. Build the timeline as complete as you can." The hearing on Robert's motion took place in a county courtroom that smelled of floor wax and old wood. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for careful deliberation. Webb attended with 2 attorneys from a Missoula firm, both carrying leather briefcases and exuding the confidence of people who'd never lost a case they couldn't afford to lose. Rourke presented the medical records first, walking Judge Morrison through Thomas Chen's condition at the time of the alleged sale. The hospice physician testified by deposition, stating unequivocally that Thomas had lacked capacity to execute legal documents during the period in question. Rourke then presented the timeline, showing how the money had appeared and disappeared from Thomas's account in a pattern inconsistent with his financial history. Summit Ridge's attorneys responded with Vickery's affidavit and the photographs of the signing. They argued that a notary's sworn statement carried presumption of validity, that the medical record showed Thomas had periods of lucidity, and that Robert was a disgruntled heir trying to overturn a legitimate business transaction. Judge Morrison took the matter under advisement. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, Webb approached Robert with his attorneys flanking him. "You're making a mistake," Webb said. "Even if you win this, you'll spend years in litigation. We'll appeal, we'll file counterclaims, we'll tie you up until you're bankrupt. And for what? A piece of scrubland that was worthless before we developed it?" "It was my uncle's," Robert said. "Your uncle sold it. Let it go." Robert walked away. He drove back to the motel where he'd been staying, a single room with thin walls and a view of the parking lot. He'd spent most of his savings on attorney fees and investigation costs. His severance was nearly gone, but he'd lived on less. He'd survived layoffs and foreclosures and the death of everyone who'd mattered to him. He could survive this. The judge's ruling came 2 weeks later. Judge Morrison found that Thomas Chen had lacked capacity at the time of the alleged sale, and that the circumstances surrounding the transaction raised substantial questions about its validity. She voided the property transfer and ordered Summit Ridge to cease all construction pending further proceedings. The company was given 30 days to appeal. Webb's attorneys filed their appeal the same day, but they also did something else. That evening, as Robert sat in his motel room reviewing the judge's order, someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find 2 men in suits. Not lawyers, but something harder. They didn't introduce themselves. "Mr. Webb wants you to understand something," the larger one said. "This property dispute could get complicated. People could get hurt. Accidents happen on construction sites. Houses catch fire. You seem like a smart guy, smart enough to know when to walk away. Robert felt his heart accelerate, but he kept his voice level. Tell Webb I'll see him in court. The men left. Robert locked the door and called Patricia Rourke, who told him to file a police report immediately. He did. The officers who took the report were professional but skeptical. Threats weren't assaults. Words weren't evidence. They'd increase patrols near his motel, but there wasn't much else they could do. Robert didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark thinking about his uncle, about the ranch, about how far men like Webb would go to protect their investments. In the morning, he called Sarah Corrigan. "They threatened me," he said. "I need you to write down everything they said exactly as you remember it, and I need you to stay visible. Go to public places. Don't be alone." Corrigan paused. "We're close to moving on this. The Bureau's been building a case. We've identified 8 properties that fit the pattern, and we've traced some of the offshore accounts. But we need a little more time." "How much time? A week? Maybe 2?" Robert spent those weeks moving between the library, coffee shops, and Patricia Rourke's office. He avoided the motel except to sleep, and when he did sleep, he kept a chair wedged under the door handle. During the day, he continued researching Summit Ridge's transactions, finding more elderly victims, more questionable transfers, more money vanishing into offshore accounts. The scale of the operation was larger than he'd imagined. Over 4 years, Webb and his associates had acquired more than 2,000 acres across western Montana, almost always from vulnerable elderly owners, almost always through Martin Vickery's notarizations. The FBI moved on a Tuesday morning. Agents arrived simultaneously at Summit Ridge's office in Missoula, Martin Vickery's bank in Lewiston, and Marcus Webb's home in Bozeman. They executed search warrants, seized computers and financial records, and arrested Webb, Vickery, and Daniel Garrett. Jennifer Castellano, the attorney, was also taken into custody. The operation made the evening news. Footage of agents carrying boxes from Webb's office, reporters shouting questions, Webb in handcuffs refusing to comment. Sarah Corrigan called Robert that afternoon. "We've got them. Bank records, email correspondence, offshore account access. Webb was running this operation for 4 years. Your uncle was victim number 17. 17, Robert repeated. 17 families who lost property. Total value around $12 million. Most of it elderly victims who couldn't fight back." Corrigan's voice carried satisfaction. "But you fought back? And because you did, we were able to build a case that'll put them away for a long time." The criminal trial took place 8 months later. Robert attended every day, sitting in the gallery and watching as prosecutors presented evidence of wire fraud, bank fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering. Webb's attorneys mounted an aggressive defense, arguing that the transactions were legitimate business deals and that any irregularities were the result of subordinates acting without Webb's knowledge. But the paper trail was devastating. Emails showed Webb instructing Vickery on which properties to target. Financial records showed payments from Summit Ridge to Garrett for favorable assessments. Offshore banking records showed Webb transferring the stolen money to accounts he controlled. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Webb guilty on all counts. Vickery and Garrett were convicted of conspiracy and fraud. Jennifer Castellano was acquitted on some charges, but convicted of facilitating the fraud through improper legal documentation. Webb was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Vickery received 8 years. Garrett received 5. Castellano received 3 years and disbarment. The judge also ordered restitution to all victims and forfeiture of all properties acquired through the fraud scheme. Robert's uncle's ranch was officially returned to him 10 months after he'd first seen construction equipment on the land. Summit Ridge's development was half finished. Foundations and framing on 12 houses, roads graded, utilities installed. The bankruptcy court, overseeing Summit Ridge's liquidation, offered Robert a settlement. Keep the land and the partially completed structures, which he could finish and sell, or accept a cash payment of $500,000 and walk away. Patricia Rourke advised him to take the settlement. The legal fees to sort out construction liens and finish those houses will eat up any profit. Take the money. Start fresh. Robert drove out to the property one last time before making his decision. He walked through the skeletal houses, noting the quality of the framing, the positioning of the lots, the view of the mountains that had made the land valuable to Summit Ridge in the first place. His uncle had raised cattle here, had lived in a small house near the north boundary, had spent 60 years working this land. Robert had planned to retire here, to rebuild the old house, to live quietly. But looking at the half-finished development, he saw something else, an opportunity to honor his uncle's memory while securing his own future. He called Patricia Rourke. "I'll take the land and the structures. Can you help me find a contractor?" It took 18 months to complete the development. Robert hired a local builder who'd been stiffed by Summit Ridge and was eager to finish the work properly. They completed the 12 houses, installed landscaping, and marketed the development as Bitterroot Vista. The homes sold within 6 months to families from Missoula and Bozeman looking for space and mountain views. Robert cleared $2 million after expenses. He used part of the money to rebuild his uncle's original house, a small structure on the north boundary where he could see the entire property. He furnished it simply. Second-hand furniture, his uncle's old rocking chair on the porch, shelves for the books he'd always meant to read. He was 60 years old now, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and a piece of land that belonged to him without question. On a clear morning in September, Robert sat on the porch watching the sun rise over the Bitterroot Range. The families in the development below were starting their days. Cars backing out of driveways, children waiting for the school bus. The ordinary rhythms of life in a place where people felt safe and settled. His uncle would have liked seeing the land used this way, Robert thought. Not empty and deteriorating, but alive with families building their own futures. He thought about Marcus Webb occasionally, serving his sentence in a federal facility somewhere, his empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed. He thought about the other victims, families who'd recovered their properties or received restitution. He thought about how close he'd come to walking away, to accepting Webb's intimidation and letting the theft stand, but he hadn't walked away. He'd fought not because he was brave or righteous, but because his uncle had left him something that mattered, and he couldn't let it disappear without a fight. In the end, that had been enough. The morning light spread across the valley, touching the houses one by one. Robert rocked in his uncle's chair, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, the kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground when it mattered, from knowing that justice, however slow and difficult, could still prevail against wealth and power when someone refused to give up. He finished his coffee and went inside. There was work to do, repairs on the old house, maintenance on the property, appointments in town, the ordinary work of living, which was all he'd ever wanted. But now he did it on land that was truly his, earned not just through inheritance, but through perseverance. And that made all the difference.